Welcome to Expressions of Leadership. I'm your host, Michele Kawamoto Perry. In every episode, we explore how people from educators and artists to executives and entrepreneurs lead with authenticity, rise through adversity, and share the wisdom they've gained along the way. Today's guest is Ken Hartman. Ken is an award-winning writer, nationally recognized prison reform activist, and the executive director of Transformative Programming Works. After serving over 37 years of a life-without-parole sentence, Ken's sentence was commuted, and since his release, he has become a powerful voice for justice, dignity, and systemic change. Ken's story is not just one of redemption. It's about resilience, advocacy, and what it truly means to lead from within. Welcome, Ken. It's really wonderful to have you on Expressions of Leadership.
Thank you, Michele. I'm really glad to be here.
Let's go back to the beginning. You were sentenced to life without the possibility of parole at just 19 years old. Before we get into the powerful work that you've done since, can you take us back? What was life like for you before prison, and what were some of the circumstances or choices that led to that moment?
Yeah, so I grew up in North Long Beach, which is in South LA, South LA County. My father was in the military. My mother was someone who I think probably today would have been diagnosed with clinical depression, at least. And I lived in a functionally dysfunctional family. My father was in the military. He was gone a lot. So we basically were raised by our mother for much of the time. And I was a kid who needed more than I was getting, I think, from my family. And, when I was in the seventh grade, I discovered that, if I smoked pot, I felt better about myself and, in my life, and all my troubles went away. And, and that resulted in years of in and out of juvenile facilities and placements and counseling and whole variety of things that never really took for me until I was wandering around in the middle of the night drunk and high on methamphetamines, which is kind of what I did at that point in my life. And I ran into a 45-year-old man named Thomas Allen Fellows, and we got in a fist fight. And wasn't much of a fist fight. I was much bigger and stronger than him, and he died in the fight. And that's how I ended up getting life without the possibility of parole. So, I mean, my life prior to that was, from about the age of 13 until 19, when I went to prison, just, really living on the streets and, just kind of barely functioning, and lots of drugs and drinking, frankly.
So many people stay stuck in cycles of shame or regret, but you chose a different path. What was the turning point that began your transformation from incarcerated person to reform advocate?
There's a couple of things, I think, and I want to say shame is a poisonous emotion, I believe. And remorse is not. And I definitely feel remorse for the things that I did when I was a teenager. But I think the biggest thing that happened to me there were two things that were connected to the same person. I sort of, in a happenstance way, I met a woman who fell in love with me, and I fell in love with her. And, at that point in my life, this is in my middle 20s, I did not feel I had ever been loved. And I'm not saying my parents didn't love me, but I didn't feel like they did when I was a kid. And that was a really powerful, disincentive to doing the right thing, I think, looking back on it. And it's not my parents' fault. My parents had rough lives themselves. They both were essentially orphaned as children. And so I met this woman who I fell in love with me. And for like just kind of an odd thing inside of me, there was this voice that was like, oh, maybe I'm not unlovable. Maybe it is possible for me to be, considered a good person and someone that people would want to be around, and that kind of stuff. And, we entered into a relationship while I was in prison. And in those days in California, we had what were called family visits, which are essentially conjugal visits for a married couple. And we ended up having a daughter. And when my daughter was born in 1995, I mean, I tell people this all the time, but I can remember, when I first held my daughter, when she was about 2 weeks old, there was this really intense feeling inside of myself that I did not want my daughter to feel ashamed of me. And I had, I had lived a life that was not a stellar life by any stretch of the imagination. And I felt that that moment I had to become better than my worst moments, and it was sort of, I think that was like the final, you know, bit of motivation for me to move forward and change who I was. And then that resulted in me trying to change the reality that I lived in. I felt I needed to be better than it was.
And you've said that people in prison are often portrayed as less than human, and that part of your mission has been to help the public see them as fellow human beings. How did that realization shape your early leadership?
Well, it was like I would give you. So I was watching a show on the ABC World News with Peter Jennings was the newscaster at that moment, and he was telling a story about someone in Italy who was an American citizen who had killed someone in Italy and 7 years prior, and they had been out on furlough and they hadn't come back from their furlough and they were being looked for. And I remember thinking, oh, they're letting people out on furlough from prison. I seemed impossible to me, and it sort of led me on this, discovery quest of trying to find out how other countries ran their prison systems and how other prison systems function outside of California. And I discovered that what I thought was the norm was not really the norm at all. And the vast majority of the world, uh, particularly the industrialized world, treats the people in prison vastly better than they do in this country to this day. Frankly, that hasn't changed. It has changed some, but not that much. And and when I analyzed that in my own reading and my own thinking, I think there was a very effective campaign that took off probably in the 80s, and went really the rest of the century, the 1900s, that really sort of sought out to dehumanize people in prison and portray them as, monsters, as not like us, whatever you want to call it. And that allowed sort of mass incarceration to really take off because if the people you're locking up aren't really people, they're not real humans like the rest of us, there's something wrong with them fundamentally, some intrinsic, evil gene or something, then it becomes much easier to do the kinds of things that have happened in our criminal justice system in the United States, which, is really the vast majority of it runs really poorly, has very poor outcomes, spends huge amounts of money, particularly relative to other countries, and it's become a kind of like an inside knowledge that it is just run the worst possible way it could be run. And if we keep doing it, and there aren't good explanations for why we do this, but some people think it's because people profit from it. Some people think it's because we just have a kind of punitive bent in this country that goes all the way back to slavery and and the genocide of native peoples. I mean, there's like lots of theories of how this is, but in practice, what it means is that we're very good at othering people in this country from the very beginning, and those others are not like us. So I felt like the first thing we had to do is figure out how do we undo that. And so I started on a lot of projects from inside to try to figure out ways of undoing that othering of people in prison who, like I say when I speak in colleges, since I've been out, the first thing you need to know about people in prison is they're just like you. They're just fellow human beings, just like you are. So, and I think maybe if we want to make real change, we have to find out how we can change that perception that people are different inside.
You mentioned that there are different theories as to why incarcerated people are treated so differently in the United States versus other countries. Why do you personally think it's different here compared to elsewhere based on the conversations and experiences that you've had?
I think, and this is just yeah, my personal take, and I don't think I have the final answer, but my sense of it is it's a sort of a combination of all of these things. I think it goes back to this kind of puritanical sort of way our some of our system was originally set up by the original settlers that came here from Europe. I think that I think it is rooted. Some of it is clearly rooted in the enslavement of people in this country for hundreds of years. So I think to do those things, the people who were doing them had to be able to look at these other people and go, they're not like us, so it's okay to do this. I mean, I think it's, and you can apply that to lots of terrible things that have happened throughout history. The first thing you have to do is other the people that you want to harm, and then you can sort of, in your own moral compass inside of you, can go, oh, well, it's okay to harm them because they're not like us, they're different, they're bad somehow. So I think that's a big piece of it. And I also think, just to be, maybe a more, you know uh simpler answer, more pedestrian answer, I think politics played a big role in it too, frankly, at the end of the 20th century. I think that because of the change in the demographics of the country, the change of things like civil rights, and how different groups are going to be accorded equal status with other groups that sort of had higher status and saw themselves as losing it. I think all those things sort of work together too, where you had a primarily one political party, but not exclusively, sought to profit off of that and convince people that they were, under attack. And it was just like, we have to lock up all of these monsters as much as we can and give them as much time as possible. And again, only realizing over the past 10 years or so what a just a dismal failure that's been, and how many just, billions and billions and billions of dollars and countless lives have been, wasted in this stupid pursuit. So
I'd love to hear more about the honor program. You launched it after nearly 2 decades behind bars. What prompted you to create it, and what was the vision behind it?
so fundamentally, I mean, it was a kind of is a pragmatic decision in some level. I mean, at that point in time in California, the system had kind of melted down in many ways. There were riots constantly. There were, and a riot in prison is basically sort of like the fundamental rules of prison just evaporates. Now it's just like every man for himself, and it's just going to be this, crazy, you know, or Orwellian nut house that you're going to be in. And that's kind of what this prison system in California had devolved to in many ways. It had just become this madhouse of, violence and disorder. And by that time in my life, I was, been in prison for quite a while. I was getting a little bit older, and I was just thinking, what can we do to fix this somehow? For those of us who want to try to live a productive life and try to become better than our worst moments and all those other things that I had discussed earlier, those are hard to do when you're literally just having to fight for your existence. And anyone who's looked at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at the very bottom of that base is safety. And if you don't have that, it's very difficult to get anywhere else, and in becoming a better human or a better person. So I thought there would be a way to create an environment that was based more on asking people to be better, and that I also believed that people inside, if given a choice to be be rewarded for good behavior, which of course is clearly the better way to do things in any environment, as opposed to being punished for bad behavior. I think you would have better outcomes with the rewarding good behavior, which you learn that in your first year intro to psychology class, right? Negative reinforcement doesn't work long term. Positive reinforcement does. Somehow the prison system in the United States can't figure that out. I don't know why, but they still have trouble with that one. But so that was kind of like the idea was, let's create an environment where people would have the opportunity to live a better life, and then that would hopefully open up more things, and people would come up with ideas to do good things and be better, which it did in fact do that in more ways than I could have even imagined in the initial putting it together. I mean, I thought there was a possibility that good things could come out of it, but I also really was looking at it, how do we create a place where people could have some level of safety in their lives, and be able to function as, human beings, as opposed to like constantly being clenched up waiting for the next, burst of violence to happen around you.
Can you give an example of the types of activities you did as part of the honor program?
Oh, I mean, there's so many different things. I mean, I would say just a few things pop off the top of my head. We had an art program on the honor program, was called ASH, Artists Serving Humanity, and basically, there's a long correlation of people in prison being great artists. That goes back forever, and we had a whole bunch of great artists. And what they did is they started creating beautiful pieces of art solely for the purpose of auctioning those pieces off and then donating the money to charitable groups, that were serving the local community where the prison was, and then the communities where people came to prison from. They raised enormous amounts of money, relatively speaking, for folks inside. So there's one right off we had a guy created a sign language class. We had guys who were teaching math classes. We had a guy who basically taught a competitive GED program that bested the CDCR's GED program at the prison every year, and had 3 or 4 times as many GED graduates as the one that was run by the CDCR. I taught a writing class myself. We had many folks get published. I mean, I think it when I look back on it, I think one of the things that it really was very successful at was giving people a sense of agency. I can make something happen by myself, by me. I don't need someone to tell me, you need to do this, you need to get up here, you need to go there. I could do something for myself. And many folks inside decided they want to do something that was good, that would help other people. Because, of course, I tell this to people all the time, the vast majority of people in prison do in fact feel remorse for the things that brought them to prison, would like a way to try to atone for that and to balance the scales in some way. And when people saw there was an opportunity to do that, they rushed for it. I used to tell folks, the waiting list for the programs were just pages and pages long of people who wanted to get involved in the things that we managed to bring in. So it allowed a kind of flowering of humanity by a bunch of people who generally weren't considered to be full humans. So I think it was a great example of the people in prison actually really are fellow human beings. If they're given the opportunity to be treated like humans, they often will act like them.
And you talked about agency just now. What were some of the other core principles that made it work?
I think again, when we get to agency, and we get to then you had to make a commitment to do certain things. You had to make a commitment to not be involved in any violence, to not be involved in any gang activity, to be willing to be voluntarily tested for substance use. In prison, there's a very high correlation between the amount of drugs that are on a facility and the amount of violence and disorder that are on a facility. So the core principles were you had to sign an agreement with your signature on it, like humans do. I give you my signature on it. That means it's really me. Which is not something that is normally done in prison. And you had to agree to this whole set of restrictions. No violence, no gang stuff, no drugs, no alcohol. You had to program. You had to take a job if you were offered a job. You had to participate in things. You weren't just there to stand around and sit on the grass and do nothing. The idea is that it was a place where people came to do actively be involved in their own lives and actively be involved in improving things and making the world better. So I think that was those are the core principles of become someone who is doing something for the betterment of yourself and others.
We're just getting started in this powerful conversation with guest Ken Hartman. We'll be back after this short break. We'd love for you to be a part of the Expressions of Leadership community. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts and connect with us on Instagram and YouTube at Expressions of Leadership. Welcome back to Expressions of Leadership. I'm Michele Kawamoto Perry, and today I'm speaking with Ken Hartman about the journey from incarceration to advocacy and what it takes to lead real change from the inside out. Let's continue. This program also focused on racial integration and,
Mm-hmm.
as you said, alternatives to violence. That's radical inside a maximum security prison. How did you build buy-in across such deep divides?
I think again we rewarded positive behavior, right? I mean, that's the to me that was sort of like the key to everything is you can beat somebody over the head to try to get them to do something, and ultimately you can't get a big enough stick because it would just people just like I've been hitting my head so many times now it doesn't make any difference. Like for a good example would be, and I want to really be clear, this was somebody else's idea, not mine. One of the some of the other folks that I worked with to help put this together. But so we created a softball league, and the softball league was, people love sports. Guys in prison love sports. Young men love sports. I mean, it's just the nature of the world. I personally love sports too. And we created this softball league, and we had like real prizes for winning at the end and all that kind of stuff. And the interesting thing part of it was like, so if you want to create a team and you want to play in the softball league, anybody can do it, but no team can be only one race. Every team has to be integrated. So you cannot, so there were no single race teams. And that's radical in and of itself. In prison, people from different ethnic groups, different racial groups don't play sports together unless they're maybe on opposing teams, but they wouldn't play on the same team together. And some people, well, I don't want to play baseball then because I'm not playing with something. We were like, okay, that's fine. You don't have to play baseball, but if you want to play baseball, you have to have an integrated team to play. And the interesting thing was every year, the team that was the most integrated team was the team that always won championship every year. So it gradually worked to where every team was like, well, we're going to have to get the best players. We're not going to just get people who look like us. We're going to get people who are actually good players so we can actually win. So and again, we didn't force anybody to do this. It was this like, if you want to play, this is what you have to do. You don't have to play. That's no one's forcing you to play baseball, but so I think it allowed people to make a choice to do the right thing, and they felt like they were doing it of their own accord. It wasn't like we're going to assign you to a baseball team that's going to have these people on it, and you're just going to have to play. That wouldn't work. Most people just say I quit. But by making it a positive incentive to play, getting rewards at the end if you win, and then it was like, well, we got to have the best team possible to win, which means we have to pick the best players. So I think that's like one of my favorite examples of how it worked really effectively.
What changes did you notice from the participants in the sports teams?
So first of all, I saw many great relationships develop from that, and prison is often portrayed as this like radically racially divided society. There's some truth in that, but you live in a prison, you are interacting with everyone every day. So people get to know each other, and you take classes together, or maybe you work in the same work environment every day or whatever. So relationships get built. I think because they were playing together on a team and they were playing to win together, that's like a different kind of relationship, particularly among young men and even middle-aged men. So lots of great relationships were formed from that, and those relationships carried over into everyday life, where you would see people who were on the same team walking to the chow hall together and eating at the same table together because we're talking about the sport here or the game we're doing. So we're all going to eat together because we're all on the same team, even though we look different. And maybe in some places you wouldn't do that. And you saw a lot of that. And then people just became friends. And I think the people who were playing the sports and were playing the games were often guys who were considered more leadership type guys that were people, looked at as sort of an example of how to act. And I think that example was being set for people. Oh, I actually can talk to people of different racial groups. I can actually walk around with them. I can sit down and eat with them. So I think it had this huge it flowed into other parts of a person's life, and it had a big impact on people.
And what surprised you the most about yourself as you began to lead others in this context?
That's a good question. I think a few things. I found that I derived a lot of pleasure in setting a good example for people. I really did. And I was looked up to by a lot of people. I know that. I was older, I had a lot of influence on how things were set up and all that. And when I was younger, I lived for myself. I didn't care about pretty much anybody. I cared about my own, what I wanted. And that's all that really mattered to me. And I found myself caring about what other people wanted and needed, and how could I help them get that. And that led me to liking me more. When I was a selfish jerk, frankly, I didn't like myself very much at all. And then years later, when I'm doing these things, motivated in many ways, again, because I didn't want my daughter to be ashamed of me. I wanted my daughter to say, well, my daddy's in prison, but he's a good guy. He does good things, at least, and when I'd be out in the visiting room visiting with my daughter, people would be coming up talking to me and thanking me for this or asking me about that. And my daughter would be watching all this. I knew she was. And so it helped me learn that being altruistic and being willing to make personal sacrifices for other people is really so much more important than getting things for yourself. At the end of the day, the things you get for yourself are usually like meh. But doing it for others is just so much more ultimately satisfying.
You're listening to Expressions of Leadership. We're exploring what leadership looks like with Ken Hartman, whose story is as inspiring as it is eye-opening. Stay with us. We'll be back in just a moment. By partnering with Expressions of Leadership, you'll reach an audience of professionals passionate about leadership and growth. For sponsorship opportunities, please contact us at letstalk@expressionsofleadership.com. Welcome back to Expressions of Leadership. I'm your host, Michele Kawamoto Perry, and I'm here with Ken Hartman. Before the break, we were talking about building community and accountability inside prison. Let's dive back in. You mentioned that safety is foundational to human thriving and that you created a reality that was safe and predictable. Can you talk more about what that looked like in practice?
Yeah, I mean, it's the numbers are actually pretty startling when you look back on it. We did an analysis. So the facility that we converted to the honor program was at one time was known as Thunderdome. To give you a sense of what was going on there, it was basically some post-apocalyptic madhouse. Well, a lot of violence, a lot of people being hurt, a lot of people suffering a variety of injuries and whatnot, including staff. When we converted it to the honor program, when we compared, like a couple of years later, we looked at like 2 years before and 2 years after, what was the outcome as far as violence and drugs and weapons and all that kind of stuff. Everything decreased by double digits, and in some cases by like 95%. So we really, we transformed what had been, and frankly, a normal maximum security facility in a California prison into a really not normal maximum security facility in a California prison. Really, in many ways, by you know giving people agency to make decisions on their own, to expecting them to do better, getting them to sign a contract saying they would do better, and then holding people accountable. I mean, when people made the wrong choices, they would have to leave the facility and they could apply to come back after a certain period of time. But so really just dramatic decreases in violence to the point that people. I remember we had a few associate wardens from another institution in California. We were standing on the roadway looking out onto the main yard, the recreation yard, and there were people literally sitting in the grass or sleeping in the grass. And this one associate warden looked at me and goes, there are people sleeping in the grass? Like, how did that happen? And I said, well, they feel safe. I mean, when you feel safe, you can sleep in the grass. When you don't feel safe, you don't feel safe to do that. So, and it really was just simply people felt comfortable enough to be able to take a nap in the grass, and people did it all the time, actually. And that's, I think, a real testament to just the level of a sense of this is a safe place to be. I just want to be really clear, it was still a prison. It wasn't like Xanadu or something, but it was a pretty, as far as prisons go in California, it was an extremely safe place to live.
And what kind of resistance did you face from the system or from other incarcerated people when you were launching something so different?
I mean, I think probably there are certain groups of folks on both sides of the fence within the officers and within the incarcerated people, who are invested in the other way of things happening inside a prison. And those groups on both sides of the fence resisted and undermined and did everything they could to try to make it go away, because I think for both sides, they were invested in prison being a failure and being dangerous and violent because it served their own ends, what they hoped to accomplish, and whether that be, sell drugs, engage in violence, perpetrate racial discord, continue to see folks inside portrayed as less than human and dangerous and monsters and all that. And all of that was dependent on this dysfunctional, violent, chaos that was kind of what the average prison looked like in California at that time. And when a yard appears that nothing really is different about the yard other than there's a different way of running it, I think that really threatened that sort of status quo of this is how it has to be. And if we lose that, we'll lose our power, we'll lose our influence on things, because people will say, well, it doesn't have to be like that. Actually, it can be like that. And that looks better to me. It would look better to any rational person, I think, including the rational humans who are in prison, who are probably the majority of people in there actually are pretty rational. By the time they get to prison, the irrational part of them is usually, in their past. And they're like saying, yeah, this makes a lot more sense to me too.
So, Ken, did you have any mentors that had a significant impact on your life?
Yeah, I can. When I look back to like very early when I first came into prison, I would, like a lot of young men, I was really discombobulated and was really drawn toward, gang type stuff, and how can I become like a super tough guy and all that. And there was one guy who was quite a bit older than me, and we had become friends because we worked in the same place, so we got to know each other, having a job in a similar area. And he took a liking to me, and at one point, I'll never forget, I want to meet you down at the library this weekend. And to get to the library, you had to go down like a couple of paths, and it would get you like away from everybody else. And we went and sat at like this table is outside with a big umbrella on it, like, out in front of Taco Bell or something. And we were sitting at that table, and he turned to me and he said, he called me youngster. He goes, youngster, you're going the wrong direction. And I was like, what are you talking about? And he said, the people that you want to hang around with, they're actually really terrible people, and they're nothing good will come of that. And we sort of had this back and forth, and I was, like a lot of young men, I thought I knew what I was doing, and I'm, nobody's going to tell me what to do and everything. But he did something that I thought was, when I look back on it, was a very sophisticated mentor sort of move. He goes, well, you know what? He says, let's make a deal. And I go, really? What's the deal? And he said, I believe that by the time you're 30 years old, you might think differently. He says, but if you make the decision now, it'd be very difficult to get out from under that decision. He goes, what if I say, let's make a deal. You won't make any decision of this stuff until you're 30 years old. I thought about that, and I was like, okay, that seems reasonable. I could do that, and he and I were really close. We hung out together all the time, and I kind of didn't want to disappoint him, so I agreed to that. And like literally within a year of being there, I was like, oh my God, that was like, whew, glad I didn't make any of those decisions, because I would have regretted that probably for the rest of my life. So, I mean, and again, it was just it was a gesture. I think it's important to contextualize this. Saying what he was saying was actually dangerous for him to say, because you can't speak ill of people who have that kind of power. And he was like, they are not good people. These are bad people. You do not want anything to do with them. And then many years later, a wonderful man who has since departed to whatever awaits us, named David Scott Milton. He was a writing teacher. He came in from the streets to do writing classes, and it was when I very first was thinking about writing, and he was my first writing mentor. And he would always tell me, he taught screenwriting classes at USC, University of Southern California, and he would say, I have some of the best prepared students in the world. He goes, these kids are like super smart, super educated. They know how to write anything. He goes, but you know what they don't have? They don't have good stories. He goes, you guys have great stories. He goes, you just have to learn how to write a little better, but you have great stories. So it was sort of like it was very sort of affirming and made me have a lot more confidence that I had something to actually say. So it really helped me become a writer, and we were friends, I'm happy to say that when I got out, I did get to see him, shortly before he passed away. But it was really nice to be able to see him on the outside. So there's two mentors. There's probably others along the way, but those are two that stick in my mind.
We're going to take a short pause here. We'll be right back with more insights from Ken Hartman. True transformation starts from within. The Forward Project partners with organizations to create meaningful culture shifts and develop leaders who inspire real change. If your team is ready to move forward with purpose, visit www.theforwardproject.co. This is Expressions of Leadership. I'm Michele Kawamoto Perry, and I'm here with Ken Hartman, whose work challenges how we think about safety, dignity, and transformation in the justice system. Let's get back to it. You've written powerfully about intergenerational trauma and the prison system's failure to heal. How does your leadership today aim to shift that narrative?
Well, so in 2017, Governor Brown commuted my sentence and I was able to get out. I had life without the possibility of parole. I assumed I would die in prison. And I was doing the best that I could to make the world inside prison a little better where I was there. But I got out and I ended up, I'm now the executive director of an organization called Transformative Programming Works. And we are a collective of, as a last count, about 106 community-based organizations that all provide rehabilitative programming inside of California prisons. Collectively, every facility, every prison in California has someone providing programs that are part of our collective. And again, I'm the executive director of that. And all of these programs fundamentally, I think, based on a few pretty simple principles, although they do many different ways of doing it. But I think, the idea that, again, you know, people don't wake up one day and say, I'm just going to be bad now. That's generally not how it works. People are, things happen to them. They suffer trauma. They suffer a variety of bad things, usually as children. And then they have a long period of time of trying to figure out how to, heal from that and again, become better than their worst moments. And that's like one of the core principles of these organizations, what they're doing almost a variety of modalities, whether it's art or therapy or service or dog training or yoga, or, there's like a million different 106 organizations with 106 approaches to how do you do that? And pretty much everyone in prison, there's the scale, the name doesn't come to my mind right now, but if you score a certain number of points, it's indicative of, your likelihood to go to prison, to have heart disease, to get cancer. I mean, it's a adult, it's adverse childhood experiences, the ACE score. And pretty much everyone in prison has a high ACE score. I know I have a very high ACE score, and pretty much everyone else in prison does. And that adverse childhood experiences tends to lead toward bad things. And how do you fix that? Is you need programs to help people come to terms with the trauma that's happened to them and the trauma they have caused other people too, as well, just as much. And that's what the programs do that I help represent. And I help the government find more money to give them to be able to go in and do more programming, to help try to create a better environment for organizations to go in and be able to provide their programs, and work with the governor's office, the legislature, the leadership at California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. And, I tell people all the time, I have the great privilege of representing the interests of programs that help me become a better human being. So it's a full circle moment for me, and I think I take it very seriously. It's a very humbling experience for me at so many levels.
As you said, you speak with legislators and policymakers and governors. What are you trying to then help them see? And how do you use your personal story in those conversations?
Oh, I mean, I what I'm trying to help them see. Usually, to step back a second from that is, so I walk into the room, I have a suit on, I speak relatively well, I'm here somewhat fluent, I guess, and I usually, when I'm first meeting someone, I'll start talking about the programs inside and what they're doing and how important they are. And then usually at some point I will transition to, and I served 38 years in prison, and many of these programs helped me. And usually there's a moment where I can see them kind of go, oh, I did not expect that, and I think that, there's that lived experience, they call it. Seems a little unnecessary, those two words together, but it's what we say these days, the lived experience. And so I have a lot of lived experience of these kind of things, and not just me. We bring lots of folks in who also have lived experience, who direct experience of being in prison, participate in these kind of programs, and how they work and why they work. And my story, along with many other folks' stories, I think it illustrates to people when, when they look at you and they see a functioning, successful, person trying to do good in the world, and you go, oh, and I was in that same prison for 38 years. That, I think, it makes them go, oh, I guess maybe these programs can actually work.
I'd like to talk more about dignity. What role does dignity play in how you lead and in what you advocate for when it comes to reform?
Well, I mean, I think just a couple of ways of looking at that. One, again, I think dignity is directly connected to seeing someone as a fellow human being. If you don't see them as human beings, they really aren't capable of having dignity, I think. Um, and I think it also, I think it's one of the things that I believe is really important is prison is an extraordinarily traumatic experience for people who are in prison. It causes immense suffering. It also causes immense suffering and tremendous trauma to people who work in prison. So, like, I think if we're saying that we need to see other human beings as fellow human beings, that means everybody, not just the people that we think are on our team, as opposed to people that are on the other team. So I spend a lot of time talking to correctional officers. I know a lot of correctional officers. It's important that their needs are also addressed in this, and creating functioning, safe, you know, rational prisons is in their best interest too, actually. So I mean, I think, and then on a personal level, I have a team of three other people who work for me at some level. Sometimes I feel like I work for them, but I believe that I treat everyone that I work with dignity, and I try to do everything I can to help uplift them and help them become better and help them be successful in what they're doing. I feel like as a leader, my job is to help them be better and do better and be successful. At the end of the day, I tell all of them that none of this would work without them. So, I feel really grateful to work with very talented people, much younger than I am, I have to admit. But
And so, in your coaching and teaching, especially with reentry populations, what's one leadership trait you try to cultivate in others?
I think for me, in those roles, I think it's the first thing I try to help people see is that they belong where they are. They matter where they are. When you first get out of prison, you really do feel like you're coming to another planet sometimes. You're in a radically different world in the sense of how people interact with each other, what the expectations are. So I think the first thing you have to do is help someone see that they matter where they are. What happens to them and how they interact with other people is important, and they are important. And I think that's, to me, if I think you have to start there. And so I do some reentry work. I do help people. I do writing classes for Theater Worker Project, an organization, one of our member organizations, and I give guys writing assignments who have just recently been paroled. And every assignment I try to do is help them see themselves in this new life, and how they can be successful in it. and why they belong in that new life, why it's important for them to be where they are.
As we begin to close out this conversation, we're taking one final break. We'll be right back with some final thoughts and words of wisdom from Ken Hartman. Don't miss a thing. Follow Expressions of Leadership on your favorite podcast app and connect with us on Instagram and YouTube at Expressions of Leadership. Welcome back to Expressions of Leadership. I'm your host, Michele Kawamoto Perry, and I'm joined by Ken Hartman. Let's return to our conversation with some final thoughts and words of wisdom. When you think about legacy, not just personally, but collectively, what do you hope that your work leaves behind?
I guess I hope that my work leaves behind maybe a couple of things. Uh, First and foremost, I hope that my work leaves behind a legacy of supporting human beings becoming their best selves, giving them opportunities to become their best selves. An acknowledgement that there's no one program that works for everybody, and every program does work for some people. And again, at every opportunity, helping people see folks inside as fellow human beings that are, not from another planet or species or something. They're just community members, who made poor choices, generally speaking. Um, and on a personal level, I hope my legacy is that my daughter will say that I was a good father. I mean, I think that's maybe the number one thing, and that the people in my life remember me as someone who treated them with dignity and treated them with kindness and compassion. And I get up every day, every morning when I wake up, and I find myself not in prison, because I was in prison for a very long time. So I'm sometimes still a little like, I'm not in prison again, and I say to myself, I want to strive to be a good man today. I literally say that to myself every morning. I'm going to strive to be a good man today. And I try to never miss an opportunity to be a good man, whatever that might be, whether it's a kind word to someone, offering to help somebody walk across the street. I've literally done that, or it's just, when someone says hello, saying hello back with a smile and then being nice to folks. One of the first things I noticed when I got out is that when people are at a restaurant, often when the wait staff come, they're invisible. And I literally say thank you. I pick plates up and hand them to folks. I feel like it's really important to remember that the people who are picking up the plates are also fellow human beings. So I try to make that as a daily routine in my life of treating people like human beings.
You've talked about the impact of your daughter. How has fatherhood shaped your leadership?
Oh God, in so many ways. I first and foremost, I look back on my poor father, and I have so much more sympathy for him, looking back, than I probably did prior to becoming a father myself. Um, I think the core of it is, when you see how much influence you have on another human being, and you see how much they are looking literally up at you for examples, for advice, for who should I be in the world, I think that I found that to be really, really powerfully motivating, for me to become better, for me to be, someone my daughter would not be ashamed of, and to take that further, someone that my daughter could actually be proud of and could say, I love my dad. And she says that all the time. And she tells me all the time, I'm a great father. And there are no words that mean more to me than that, I think. If my headstone said he was a good father, that would be the best possible headstone I could imagine. But yeah, I mean, I think as far as my leadership goes, I see how important it is when you're in a role where people are looking to you for an example, how much you have to be really intentional and really think about what you say and what you do. And, you can't take a day off from being a father. You're a father for the rest of your life. That's the reality of it. And I think that means that, I have to be careful, and I have to think what I'm going to do, and why am I doing it, and is this the best thing to do in light of everything else, and how is that going to impact my role as a father or my role as a leader. And I think these are, important. And I want to be really clear. I am not perfect, and I've made mistakes multiple times. But I have definitely can say that I really have been intentional and thoughtful, and really tried my very best to, be both a good father and a good leader. And I like to think I've been pretty good at both. So,
If you could pick one thing that your daughter gained from you through example, what would that be?
I think it would be that it is important and correct and worthwhile to do what you believe is right, even when there's opposition.
Well, that brings us to the final segment of the show where we ask our guest one advice question and one fun question. Starting with the advice question, what's one piece of advice you'd offer to someone who feels stuck, whether in a job or a system or a circumstance, about reclaiming their own leadership?
I thought about that, and I think, for me at least, what has always worked for me is, if I feel stuck, I will say to myself, okay, what's got me stuck, and I try to dissect it and pull it apart and say, what is this stuckness, where is it coming from? And usually I will find that it's something inside of me. It isn't something outside of me. It's usually something inside of me. And then how do I work on myself? Because once I work on myself, where I saw myself stuck, I usually now see, I now see the pathway through that. So for me, I don't feel stuck a lot, but I have felt stuck in my life a few times. Probably not shocking for someone who's in prison, but usually for me, it's just a matter of sitting back and saying, what is inside of me that is blocking me from being able to get down this path. And pretty much invariably, I always find that there's a way of seeing it differently, and then seeing that there's a way to do it. So I feel like stuckness is a place to go inside and find out what's going on inside of yourself.
And now for the final fun question. Would you rather be able to control time or fly, and why?
I mean, flying sounds really cool, I would have to admit. And, if I was able to fly, I would not have to sit in cramped seats in planes. So I guess that'd be a big plus for me. But I mean, I would probably have to be control time. And again, it's like, if I could control time, then maybe time loss could be recovered. I don't know. So I mean, that's kind of the way I look at that question there. Yeah, if I could control time, I probably could see myself going back in time and making a few better decisions. So that's why I would control time.
I think I'm with you. I'd want to control time too for exactly that reason, to be able to have a rewind button.
Yes, but I have to say, I just really want to be clear on this. You know, I believe that the place I'm in right now is the place I'm really supposed to be. And the people that I have in my life that I truly love and care about, you know, so I don't know. Maybe I would not want a rewind button, because maybe the outcome would be not what I have now. And what I have now is, you know, pretty wonderful at many levels.
Very true, indeed. Well, Ken, thank you so much for joining us on Expressions of Leadership and showing us what it means to lead from the inside out, literally and figuratively. Your story, your advocacy, and your vision are powerful reminders that leadership doesn't always come with a title, it comes with purpose.
Thank you, Michelle. I really appreciate that. I appreciate being on the show, and thank you for asking me.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. If this conversation stirred something in you, maybe a shift in thinking, or a deeper question, or even a call to act, we hope you'll carry it forward. Until next time, keep leading with intention. If you haven't done so already, make sure to click on that follow button so you don't miss out on future episodes. Have a guest you'd like us to interview? Questions, ideas, or just want to say hello? You can reach us at letstalk@expressionsofleadership.com or connect with us on Instagram or YouTube. We'd love to hear from you. And as always, thanks to our amazing team behind the scenes for making this podcast possible, including our sound engineer, Graham Palmer, and my chief encourager and advisor, Jeremiah Higgins.